share. This class is an experiment. I'm always dissatisfied. As we get further along into the semester, you'll realize that I'm both slightly enchanted by the Enlightenment and slightly repelled by it. I get excited about philosophy and science, but the idea of the Enlightenment strikes me as kind of naive. I'll just be straight up. So I always struggle to find a work of literature from the century that isn't, yeah, naive or simplistic. And I think this novel scratches the itch I have, but if anything, it's a little complicated. So I'm doing something here that I'm enjoying, but that my colleagues think I'm a little nuts for trying to teach a complicated French novel in a survey class. So it may not work. We may not do it again. Francis Bacon has a really wonderful quote that he uses to talk about books. And you should do this, maybe not tell your professors that you're doing this, but you should do this when you approach a new book. He says, there's some books that are meant to be kind of tasted, and some books are meant to be swallowed, and some books are to be digested and chewed. So those are kind of three categories of books. He says, the first one, is a book that you sort of read in parts, which is what we did with Hobbes, right? Like you sort of there are bits of this that you need, but you don't want to go too deep into this because it's kind of freaky. Some books you just swallow, meaning you're going to get through it as quickly as you possibly can. For some of you, this will be Montesquieu, but for me, actually, that Montesquieu is falling into this third category, which is that this is really subtle and it's really complicated, and I'm not sure what's going on. And so I'm actually kind of working my way through it, and I'm tasting it, and I'm trying to figure out what's happening. But I recognize that you might not feel the same way. And in a week or so, I'll kind of ask for a poll of should I do this or should I not do this again? And I don't know. We'll see. I always try to assign books I've never taught before, and that's always a risk. But you want these kinds of professors, because if your professor is always assigning the same 4 novels, then that professor is bored, and then you are bored. And so the books, we'll see about this. But I'm at least not bored, and hopefully you won't be bored. The book is divided into roughly 150 letters. So roughly first 50 letters today. We won't cover it all, but for a class on Monday, try to get through about letter 100. There's a bit of a surprise ending. So if you find yourself at the end not reading every letter, make sure you read the last 20 or 30 letters, because it kind of, there's a hook at the end. What I want to do today, I think, is talk about the background a little bit, because we haven't done a background French lecture in a while. So I want to situate it for you without taking too much time. So I'll do that, and then I'll introduce Montesquieu, and I'll ask you if you've got questions about the novel, and we'll talk about the novel as we have time. This is a novel that's, I think, primarily about 3 things. It's about family. We'll talk about family a lot, probably at the last half of today's class. It's about religion and the differences between Christianity and Islam, but also a kind of Christianity that's secularizing. But it's primarily about, not primarily, but it's also about politics, right? And it's slow to talk about politics because we're back on the continent. So in England, people have a kind of freedom of speech and tell people exactly what they think about the regime, and they're much more transparent. But we're now living in this space where people who talk about the regime in a really bold way go to jail, right? Montesquieu publishes this in, let me get the date right, 1721. 3 years before the book was published, Voltaire was put in the Bastille for criticizing the regime. It's like, this is not, we're not in a freedom of speech place. We're back in kind of Machiavelli's Italy. So this is a book that has, it's subtle in the way Machiavelli's was. He wants to change the world, but he can't come right out and say what he thinks, or he goes to jail, which might explain why he uses such bizarre, kind of flawed, quirky, colorful narrators. Because if you put anything in the mouth of a Persian Muslim, then they might not be blamed for saying something that you want to raise these questions, but then not get in trouble for raising the questions. Does that make sense? But it means that the novel's a little maddening because he doesn't just come right out and tell you what he thinks. We've kind of walked around this before, but I want to yeah, let's talk about France and situate France as this emerging place of modernity. France had been, and here I want to go back. So we last really talked about France in the 17th century as a place where the wars of religion had sort of wreaked havoc. And France had come to an uneasy peace, whereby at the end of the 16th century, you got a Protestant king who converted to Catholicism so that France could have one nation under one faith, but then granted religious toleration to many of the Protestants. So at the beginning of this century, France was a more cosmopolitan, more religiously diverse place than, say, either Spain or Italy. But then in the space of the 17th century, Europe was seized by these wars of religion. And so what everyone thought, well, the Reformation's over, maybe we can get along. No. And so the English Civil War we've come back to a lot, the kind of question of will England be Puritan or Anglican or Catholic, or 30 Years' War kills about a third of the population of Germany, and in this part it actually kills like 75%. It's a devastating war, and at the end of it, Europe seems interested in like, okay, how can we have peace? In Holland and in England, they moved toward a system of religious toleration, not in France. And so that's part of the story we will kind of want to uncover in the background. There also is a sense, and this is a total tangent, and I won't put this on the exam, but this is just like part of the standard European history exam. There's a sense in which a lot of the old monarchies are getting really weak and are being replaced. So at the beginning of our story, the King of Spain is the most powerful monarch, but he's like simultaneously, which guy is it, Charles V? Yeah, he's simultaneously like married to the Queen of England, and he's in charge of Spain, and he's got all of Latin America, and he's also the Holy Roman Emperor. But the Spanish monarchy kind of goes decrepit. You can see that this is about the time of our story, the Spanish monarch is a man by the name of Charles II. And if you follow his family tree backward, you'll discover that Charles II has too few grandparents. Like there are a lot of cousin marriages in his family tree. And so the Spanish monarchy has sort of, I don't know how to say this without being politically incorrect. He's mentally weak and he is physically deformed, and his jaw is not quite right and his nose isn't quite right. And so he's sort of frail. The one strong monarchy left on the continent has become the French monarchy, and they're sort of using the weakness of everyone else and the division of everyone else to dominate their neighbors. And that's the context into which Montesquieu is born. The story by which that happens, I don't want to dwell over much on this, represents a sort of cunning marriage of religion and politics in a way that in the short term created a tremendous amount of power, but in the long term, I think was really bad for France. When Louis the 14th was very young, Louis the 14th is the great king at the beginning of our novel. His father dies, Louis the 13th, when he's very young. His mother was Marie de Medici, so from this really famous, powerful Italian family. And the power behind the throne in France was a man who became famous named Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu is a kind of, he's a Machiavellian prince in a way, but he's a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church. And he decides that what is really important to him is the greatness of France. He's never going to have his own dynasty. He's a cardinal, but he's willing to do everything and sell everything and betray everything in order to make France great. And he's willing to do that even by like helping the other side in the wars of religion. And so the greatest supporter of the Protestants in the 30 Years' War is actually the French government. They're sending all this money in these mercenaries because what they want is they want to like make the Catholics weaker, and then France will emerge as this great Catholic. And so if you're a fan of French literature and or maybe not French literature, but like swashbuckling movies, right? The Hollywood stuff. This is the period of the Three Musketeers, when the aristoi, the noblemen, are banned from dueling, and yet they want to duel. And it's like he's trying to sort of impose centralized rule on them, and really not doing very well. Richelieu is eventually replaced by another cardinal, Cardinal Mazarin. And there is a series of sort of regents in which the state gets more and more powerful. When Louis XIV comes of age, finally, in the 1660s, and note the date there, 1661 is the same moment when Charles is coming of age, and he's sort of coming out of this period of religious warfare. But he does something that Charles could only dream of. He asserts himself as the absolute ruler of France. And he says, I'm not going to have a prime minister. I'm not going to have anyone under me who sort of runs the country while I live the life of a playboy. He's really the last monarch to like run France as the supreme leader. He styles himself as the Sun King. And a lot of the art around him has light, sort of emanates from, he's utterly in charge. He's the one, and I put this on the board last time, who says, l'état, c'est moi, which means I am the state, I am France, I am the personification of everything. And he has a curious instrument of his power. He builds this gigantic palace, a distant walk, so it's still around Paris. You can get to Paris in a carriage, but it's far enough away from Paris that you're insulated from the people in the mall. Yeah.
I think I just missed the name. Who are we talking about?
Louis XIV now. Yeah. So Louis XIV is like, he's king in 1660. Well, he's king earlier than that, but he takes personal rule in 61. And he's king for the first half of this novel. Like he's the power. But by the time you're reading about him in the Persian letters, he's old, he's weak, he's this mental force, but his physical power is diminished. But usually when historians talk about him and his secret for dominating France, they love to talk about Versailles. So Versailles is an interesting place. If I were a wealthy French nobleman, I would love to live in my own estate, where I have servants, where I'm totally in charge and who do my will. And if I were the Duc d'Ache, right, I might be happy to live in Paris, where there is beautiful art and culture and opera and food, and I would hate to live here. And he bends all of the noblemen and the noble women of France to his will by making this the only fashionable place for a person of nobility to live. And so, but you're living there in his palace, following his rules, and he sort of makes them into his own courtiers. Like Charles can't do this in England. Charles has like servants who work for him. But if I'm a duke and I show up at the palace, he would then enlist me as the man who like serves him a poached egg at 9:04 a.m. So like all of the noblemen essentially become his courtiers. And he sort of awards them favors depending upon how he feels. And he makes and breaks people. He makes them all kind of subservient to his individual will. And this is freakishly expensive, right? Lots of noblemen don't have a lot of money and they're sort of living on the cheap. And if I'm at home in my own estate, I can sort of like, cut corners, not wear the really nice clothes all the time. But if I'm constantly in front of all of the elite of France, like people are bankrupting themselves and borrowing money against their estates so that they can have the latest clothes and the latest fashions. And he uses this to sort of crush the aristocracy and make them completely subservient to himself. Does this make some sense? So the contrast between what's happening in modern England and modern France are radically different. In England, you've got this sort of weak king who secretly wants to be Catholic, but can't persuade the noblemen that they want to do it. And it's like John Locke and the Earl of Shaftesbury in Parliament. They're really kind of getting power for themselves. Louis rules entirely for like 60 years without calling a parliament once. Like he's becoming the man in France. And he seems irresistible. The Versailles has space for about 10,000 nobles, like basically half of the nobility of France move in and they live there. He turns them against each other. He obliterates all of the distinctions between like the citizen or the subject of France and the sovereign. So like local government, regional officials. He gradually breaks the power of the Protestant minority. They were living in these sort of fortress cities where they had guns and they were protected from the king. This is what the right to bear arms meant in France. And he gradually takes that away. He breaks down their fortified cities. He revokes their edicts of toleration and he makes them dependent on his will. And what's so stunning to me about this story is the nobility support this. They get really extra. He uses fashion. He uses manners. He uses glory. He makes it possible to buy more titles of nobility. So you have 3 sons. Only one of them can inherit your land, but for a terrifically expensive sum, $40 million maybe, you could buy a noble title for your 2nd son and for your 3rd son. And so what they most want is attention and honor. And he's getting money from them to fund his wars of empire, to push the boundaries of France out, toward the Rhine, into Holland. He's making himself this great power on the continent. And the peasants come to really love him too. One of the things that shows up in the book that's surprising is he sort of cultivates this idea that he rules by the grace of God. And more than that he's a personification of divine grace. So there's a little weird story in Act 4 of Macbeth. It's obscure, but the Scottish kings used to believe that they could cure diseases by touching people, right? It's like a medieval thing. It's weird in the English context. It's a vestige of old tradition. But Louis actually does this. He goes around, finds sick, he thinks he's Jesus, right? Heal the sick people. This gives you a sense of the power. And the peasants sort of love him. If things get really bad in your part of France, you might blame the tax man, you might blame the baron, but you'd be like, oh, if the king only knew how poor we were, how starving we were, he would send someone to help us. He becomes the focus of French patriotism. And this is a sort of strange little, he becomes, here you sort of see him in his military garb, getting ready for his wars of expansion. He manages to, I mean, the Spanish are really weak, so they're not a threat. The Germans don't really exist, but one of the things that he does that's actually effective, this isn't his intended legacy, is at the end of his life, he sort of convinces the rest of the Europeans that France is the superpower, and they have to be stopped. And so this alliance forms at the end of his life between, I think, German princes and Dutch princes and the English, and they send an army to Europe and they finally beat him about the time that the novel was written. So when this king finally dies in 1715, he dies kind of glorious with this incredible reputation, but also France is sort of on the edge of bankruptcy. And England is sort of finally beginning to emerge at the end of this period as a maybe world power. But like, I've spent a lot of time in England, and like virtually all the time I've spent, like I'm talking about England because it's sort of my story and it's where I did research. But England is a second-rate power. And France is the great power. And there's this little Battle of Blenheim, 1713, 1714. And John Churchill goes and fights as a general for the English. And defeats them and becomes the Duke of Marlborough. This is Winston Churchill's family. So the Churchill family becomes noble in England and powerful in this moment by finally taking this guy down. So this is the context you really need for the novel. The author, let me tell you a little about the author and then a little bit about the context, and then we'll dive in. This is the Baron Charles Secondet de Montesquieu. He's an unusual Enlightenment author. Most French Enlightenment figures are like lower middle class, and they're journalists, and they're poor, and they don't have a lot of social standing. But he's a nobleman, and you can detect in his book a kind of frustration with the crown and the way that the crown has sort of sapped nobility of its old status. They're becoming weaker and weaker and weaker. But this doesn't mean that he's not too proud to buy offices, right? He's also really famous as a judge in French history. And judges in France got their titles by buying them from the crown. It's like his family participates in this system of giving the king huge sums of money so that they can have these titles and they can sort of carry on. Montesquieu is also important, and I don't assign his novel in my other class, but when I teach American constitutionalism, I have a class right now on the Revolution and the Founding. Montesquieu is the member of the European Enlightenment that cited more than any other source by the Founding Fathers. The only other author that cited, not single author, the only other book that cited more than Montesquieu in the founding debates, anyone know what it is? It's the Bible. Right? The Bible is sort of lingua franca for people like, for American Protestants. Like the Bible's number one. And the second book most cited by the founders is a piece that Montesquieu wrote later in life, after he was famous, called The Spirit of the Laws. And one of the things as an Enlightenment philosopher, he becomes a big proponent of is limited government. Now, this is not what he gets in France. Like this is like, it's not like America wants to be French. The sense here is like, he sort of senses that there's something wrong in France. And his big idea in political science terms is the separation of powers. That you ought to, like the functions of the king and the function of the court should be really different. If you mix them too much, you'll get corruption. To say nothing of the legislature, which he thought should be really important in France, didn't exist. So France is becoming, there's this tendency toward absolutism. There are 3 other places in Europe where you'll see absolutism at really high levels, 2 of which he talks about in the novel. So one of them is Russia. It's like at the end of our reading for today, letter 49, you get this bizarre kind of just random out of nowhere discussion of Peter the Great and what things are like in Russia and how he's like, and it's because the Russians are becoming, they want to achieve greatness. And when they decide that they want to become a modern nation, scientific and progressive, they follow the French model, right? We in the United States, when we decide that we want to become a modern nation, we follow the British model, but this French model is side by side with the British. The other great nation that's seen as powerful and maybe dangerous is the Turkish nation, right? And this is where the novel is sort of slippery. It's titled The Persian Letters. He wants it to be the Persian letters because the Turks are kind of an enemy, whereas the Persians are so far away, they're like in contemporary Iran, that they're not really seen as like the hated Muslim threat. This is like a strange nation on the other side of the planet. So he's deliberately trying to make them less aggressive. But people who know Muslim history would point out that almost all of the stories and the anecdotes and the color he gives us, especially the stuff about the harem, is really about Turkey, because they don't know very much about the harem in Persia. Like almost no one's ever been there. Whereas lots of people are now going into Istanbul. And so there's a sense in which people on the know sort of realize that most of the societies that he's talking about, these absolute societies, are European societies. So don't be too captivated by the Persian part of the letters. The book is only loosely about Persia. It's really about something else. Questions about Montesquieu? This book isn't really about Montesquieu. He's trying to hide his own identity. Let me give you one more slide to give you a sense of the backdrop, and then I'll turn off the slides and we can just talk about what you think about the book. This is the political setting at the beginning of the novel. So the difference for us between 1720 and 1710 are basically like nothing at all. But the book is sort of presented as being of very recent history. And just like if I were to set a novel in the president and talked about the transition from the Obama administration and then started talking about this guy, Donald Trump, and then talk about that, like you would understand how the politics transitions. And so just to give you a little bit more background, while the novel is taking place, there's an enormous tumultuous event in French history, which is 3 of the 4 princes in French, no, actually 4 of the 5 princes in French politics died in the space of about 3 years. So like there's this sort of chaos. And the result is like a really, yeah, it's a moment of great weakness for France. So this is a portrait of the royal family, and it's designed to show you the line of succession. This is the Sun King. Like he's utterly in command. He's powerful. He's actually really quite old at this moment. He's in his 70s. Louis XIV and his son, and this is where things get complicated because they're wearing wigs and they're all designed to look like they're about 55. They've got like a slightly gray wig, but like I think this is his son. This is where things get really awful because it's like his name is Louis, right? He's the Grand Dauphin, which is the great prince. This is his son. Any guesses as to his name? Yeah, Louis. Yeah. Louis is the Petit Dauphin, which is the prince after the prince. And then he has 2 sons, both named Louis. They're not taking any chances, right? And so, yeah, the 5 of them are like in the line of succession. What happens is that in the space of a year and a half, there's a smallpox epidemic and a measles epidemic. So the smallpox epidemic takes out the son, and then the measles epidemic takes out him, his wife, and then all of his sons get the measles. And this is where modern medicine is sort of modern and sort of not. Like there are these John Locke miracle stories where somebody gets saved from liver cancer and like they survive. The prescription for measles at this point is awful. It's bloodletting. So they just start bleeding the royal family and like they start dying. Because measles is dangerous, but it's not supposed to be lethal. Your chance of dying from measles is probably 2 to 5%. Like it shouldn't kill everybody. And this is the governess. She actually saves the royal line because she kidnaps this like 4-year-old boy and just disappears with him. And they can't find him to bloodlet him. And at the end of it, everyone is dead except the king and his great grandson. And then in 1815, the king dies. And this is like, this happens while the novel takes place. This will be an event in the novel in the next section. And so the king's nephew, his brother, not named Louis, Philippe becomes the regent, but Philippe was an atheist and a libertine. And so the most wild kind of immoral person in the court becomes in charge of the court. And this is a rare moment for French literature because you're not allowed to criticize, but everyone sort of recognizes that the regime is illegitimate. And so this is not illegitimate, it's legitimate, but it's immoral. And so this becomes a moment in time that's sort of ripe for moral criticism of France. And so Montesquieu is sort of, part of what he's trying to do is this, he's very delicately trying to talk about what a good society is and whether like, and it's just so different than in Locke and Hobbes because they can just tell it like it is. You can't. So this is why the novel's got this curious, like this curious form to it. And that's called the Regency. And what looks like a little girl is in fact Louis XV. And he finally becomes, his regency ends in 1723, at which point the novel's over. So, right, that's probably all you need for backdrop. And I've got history issues, so I'm always talking about this more than I should. So that's more than you need. Thoughts or questions on the novel? My lecture's over. It's always dangerous to lecture first. And I just kind of want to talk about what you think and what your impressions are. What do you think? Do you like it? Is it strange? Is it accessible? Is it inaccessible? Is it funny? Is it boring?
It's definitely different from like what we would today consider to be a
Right.
novel, but
Right.
I can see like the similarities.
Yeah, this is a proto-novel in the same way that Pilgrim's Progress is a proto-novel. If you put the two of them together, you start to get something that looks like a modern novel. Yeah.
I think it's really enjoyable to read it and then recognize that these are real historical events that are kind of unfolding.
Right.
But they're taking place with fictional people.
Yes.
But it's
Yes.
real things happening at the same time.
Yes.
And I thought that was really
Yeah,
like a real fun aspect of what
Right.
these fictional people think of these real things
Right.
happening.
right. Yeah, almost everything that we've sort of treated before as fiction is like Paradise Lost. You drop it into a poem and you set it like in the Bible, and then that's what fiction is. This is to write fiction in the present. That's a new move. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say like about the women and like kind of how they saw women, it's just kind of hilarious. 'Cause,
Yes.
Like he's just so oblivious to like some of the cultural things that he was like actually really not okay and like women feel really uncomfortable with it. It's just like, oh, they're just, whatever. So I thought it was kind of interesting.
Have you ever read a novel about a harem before? Probably not. I've never read a novel about a harem. I mean, maybe this is, so why? Do you imagine that's a strange thing for readers? That I don't think there's anything like this. And he surely has to be kind of careful about what he says, but he's actually really pushing the envelope. I mean, I think this is like slightly scandalous for Houghton. Maybe my sense of Houghton has changed, but like some of the scenes are lurid. For early 18th century France, this is really pushing the limit on what's allowed, to the extent that Montesquieu publishes this anonymously. But I think he publishes it in France. Like this isn't like Voltaire stuff that has to be published in some Calvinist place. Like you can say this if you're careful. Yeah. Other kind of reactions. Yes, go ahead.
I definitely have issues with it.
Yeah,
Starting with the harem.
yeah,
There were definitely times where I feel like it's clear that a man wrote this.
yes,
and
yes, yes, yes,
just
yes,
Like you'd have letters from people like, oh my gosh.
Yes.
I'm just
yes,
gushing over him. Like, no,
yes,
this doesn't feel
yes,
realistic in
No.
some times. And he literally admits to raping one of his wives.
yes.
And
Rocks,
that's just kind
yeah,
of said and then ignored. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
This feels really screwed up.
it is. Yeah,
I don't know that I can be with this character much longer.
yeah, yeah. Do you think, and I'm not fishing, I've never read this book before, so I'm having some similar reactions. Do you think that Montesquieu is an idiot who doesn't know what he's doing? That's a possibility. He's brilliant on law, maybe the separation of powers, maybe he's just a terrible novelist. Or do you think he's drawing you in for a reason? Like, what do you think he's doing with this? Is he just trying to be salacious with Roxanne, or is there a purpose to it? Because as I'm reading, like this is when I'm reading a novel for the first time, this is what I'm trying to figure out. Is this a book that my professor is making me read because they're weird and like we're just going to get through this as fast as possible? Like, is this like just get it done, or is there something here that's worth like really chewing on? And the jury's out for me. We'll like this is part of what I want to talk about. Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier when you were giving your lecture how he was trying to say things without actually saying them.
Okay.
And one way to do that is to give a general feel to the reader and to give the reader these thoughts and emotions
Right.
separated from what you're actually talking about.
Right.
So by making the reader feel uncomfortable or not liking characters, he can also like relate that
Right.
back to other
Right.
characters.
Okay. Yeah. So this is good. We should look to see if this is if this is what he's trying to do, and then if he's trying to do that, does it actually work? And maybe like in theory this is good, but I don't know. Jenna?
Well, I would say that like, at least when, I mean, of course, I'm a woman reading it.
Right,
like, when
right.
I was reading it, there's this part where like he saw a woman and, whatever. But like, he was like, and after that, like the woman just treated me like really bad and like they were kind of mean to me. I don't really quite understand why. And like, as a reader, it's like you're literally an idiot, of course, like,
Yes.
you know why.
Yes.
So I wonder
Yes.
in that aspect, but I mean, obviously that's for oblivious men, like
Right.
you're not gonna read it
Right.
that way. So I think it just depends on who the audience is.
Okay.
for which word.
Really good. We should try and figure out who the audience is for this. That's really good. Go ahead.
It does seem like he is like kind of trying to play the part of the fool, because he does.
Yes. Uzbek is,
Yeah,
yes.
He does he does the writing well, and he seems to know what he is actually talking about. but it also seems like what he's actually talking about isn't something that would really be accepted in the society. So it's
Okay,
kind of like he's trying to see how far he can push it. Like how far he'll allow
Montesquieu
it.
or Uzbek?
Montesquieu.
Montesquieu, okay. Yeah, that's possible. Go ahead.
At least I personally, I don't exactly know exactly how French society was at this time,
Okay,
but. there
you can
was-
ask me questions. I mean, I'm happy to, I don't want to just dump facts at you, but if you've got like specific, is this normal? Is this not normal? I'll try to help.
There's a couple moments, like especially when they bring up harems,
Yes.
where I can only imagine the French people being like, this isn't normal.
Right,
This isn't what
right,
we do.
Right, right.
And like, I kind of felt like in those moments, that's probably Montesquieu saying, see, this is the extreme. This
Right.
is not what we want. This is not who we are.
Right.
And like trying to push the French people to be like, oh yeah, we're not like that. We're
Okay.
more civilized and
Okay.
we have boundaries.
Yes, he can count on that reaction from most readers. Yeah, you're going to react to what looks like barbarism. And this is part of what makes this novel controversial, is to the extent that that's happening, that's not okay. That's a form of kind of cultural racism, or like scholars would call it Orientalism, right? That there's this hatred of the East because it's the East. And like, if that's what he's doing, then this novel probably doesn't have redeeming value. Like we ought to just not teach it again, right? Other thoughts on this?
Didn't you say one of the people who was in power, near the end, he was immoral? And,
Yeah, that's right.
he didn't like that, so I think he might have been like talking about those things that the French people obviously didn't like to show them. Like
Okay.
how stupid it is and how ignorant that like somebody who's in power is somebody who might
Okay,
agree with this type of behavior.
good,
Yeah.
good. Yeah. As my working theory, I have something like that moving through this, that like he wants us to get angry at power figures. Like that's what he's trying to generate. And we should, as we move through, and he spends, because he opens with this harem stuff really aggressively front and center. And he wants to confront you with it, and he wants a reaction from you. And so the first 20 letters, he's not even in Paris, and he already wants you to like love and hate certain characters. And then the last 30 letters I had you look at today are set in Paris, and he's not too heavy-handed yet, but he suggests some people who might be as arbitrary in their own way as Uzbek is in his way. And so, yeah, maybe that's part of what's happening. Yeah. I want to point you to a few subtle things in the first 5 or 6 letters to give you a sense that it may not work, but he's trying to demonstrate that there's a level beneath the surface. Like he shows you that Uzbek is a really problematic narrator. So at the beginning, letter 1, we're told that Uzbek is going on a journey. He's leaving his native Persia. And why is he leaving? Like, what does he tell us right at the outset? We spent one day at Qum, which is a holy shrine. We did our prayers, like he's establishing him in the first few lines as an Orthodox Shia Muslim, because Sunni Muslims, the Turks, don't go to this shrine. So he's like already trying to tell you, this man's not a Turk. Don't hate him because he's a Turk. We should be curious about him as this kind of alien, exotic, non-Turkish Muslim. What does that look like? In the second line, we get this kind of explanation. Rika and I are perhaps the first Persians for whom the appetite of learning has prompted us to leave the land of our birth and to forsake the charms of a peaceful life in favor of the arduous quest for wisdom. So what does he tell us on the surface about why is he going to Paris? Yeah. To learn, yeah. To learn what sort of things would you expect? Yeah, to learn about French culture, to learn about the West. There's a sort of curiosity. Uzbek is presented as a man of civilization, kind of not like, but equivalent to maybe a Frenchman, because this has become fashionable for people of wealth and independence to cross this east-west barrier. Because remember, like we're just now sort of leaving the wars of religion phase. And Europeans are just beginning to think about toleration as an appropriate religious attitude. And maybe that might extend to the Muslims. So you have these very wealthy English people like Lady Montagu, who goes to Istanbul, and she's treated as a noblewoman. So she's actually housed in the women's quarter of the palace. And she's like the first white person to have been, not the first white person, because there were white slaves in the harem, but she's the first white English person to be able to actually write stories about it. It's like this, there are these people who have gone east in pursuit of knowledge. And so, yeah, he's presented as this kind of philosophic traveler. He's curious, he's open-minded. What do we gather about his background? He's Muslim. I don't know how much you know about Islam, so I don't want to do a whole lecture on Islam, but do you know what Islam teaches about? This is loaded. Do you know what 17th century Islam teaches about marriage? Like what's normal and what's not? So the Quran teaches that a good Muslim man may have 4 wives. 4, not infinite, 4. And beyond that, one is limited to concubines, and that adultery is a huge sin that is condemned all over Islam. That does not take place. Like the sexual boundaries are really firm, but then within one's household, yeah, one has pretty much power to do what one wants. And that's the way the 17th century interpretation of the Quran proceeded. And what the Turks did was considered sort of immoral beyond that, or questionable beyond that, because the Sultan of Turkey was basically the big guy in Islam, and he took as many people in his harem as he wanted. How many wives does Uzbek have? There's Fatima, there's Roxanne, there's Zahi, there's Zelis, and there's Zephys. So something is off. Because a good Muslim is not supposed to have 5 wives. A good Muslim can have up to 4. It's like we're already kind of like, there's already these things that aren't quite, yeah. So he's not a character. Things are not quite what they seem. Right. Letters 2 and 3, like he goes straight for the thing that he thinks is going to interest his readers. There's a letter to his chief eunuch. And the character of a eunuch is not well known within Western civil, like this is not, we don't do the eunuchs. But in Arab slavery from like 1,000 years prior to this, slaves that were captured usually had 2 destinations. The male slaves were generally turned into eunuchs or destined for the army. And the women were generally sold into this kind of slavery. This doesn't work because he's writing the novel about Persia. So like, this is one of those spaces where like, I need to say this, I'm not sure. He's not describing Persia, right? Like the source. So this is his sort of, he knows a little bit about Islam and he's projecting a little bit, but he thinks his readers are going to be really interested in this idea of the harem, because it's his opening move. So who do you think is reading this? I like this edition tremendously because I think the notes are superior. So I bought the Oxford edition, but I think the Penguin edition does something kind of clever with the cover. So who are reading these novels? These are there's this sort of emergence in Western countries, especially England, Holland, Switzerland, Germany, France, of literate elite women, and they become the primary novel audience, right? So the novels are sort of intended to be read politically, but the women are seen, because they're fictional, this is a space in which women can get involved and discuss issues that would normally be forbidden. So women don't have discussion groups about Locke's Second Treatise, right? Or Hobbes's Leviathan. But if Rousseau writes Heloise or Montesquieu writes the Persian letters, novels are considered acceptable things for women to discuss. I mean, slightly controversial, because the traditional moralists and like Catholic leaders would be like, no, this is a waste of your time. You should devote yourself to virtue. But so the existence of the novel itself would be something that you could talk about when you write about what the contents of the novel are really interesting for the Enlightenment. But the fact that these sorts of issues are being discussed. So yes, a man writes the novel, and yes, he writes it in a way that it's clearly a masculine presentation of the harem. But they can sort of put this side by side with Lady Montague's female description of what life is like for women in the harem. And there's a lot of curiosity about this. What's it like to be a woman in Islam? Now, his presentation of what is it actually like to be a woman in Islam? Terrible, not very helpful, like it's lurid, it's over the top. But he's using it in a way that he's trying to, like, I agree with you, like this is a hook, and it works. He sets the hook. And if this were just sort of a travel log set of notes on what Paris was like in 17, we would not care, we would not read it. But this makes us angry, and it pulls us in. And I want to point you to one or two more things before I run out of time. In letters 2 or 3, he draws your attention to the fact that this is a really unreliable narrative. So Uzbek, the second letter, is a letter to the eunuch in his harem, this man who's been castrated, so that he can take care of the harem in a virtuous way. And it's clear from later letters that this chief eunuch, like, he complains about this, that yes, he's been castrated, but it's not as if all desire has been removed for him. His life is sort of hellish, and that he has to take care of these women, and he finds them very attractive, and he can't do anything. He's sort of been, he hates his life now. So and Uzbek is entirely oblivious to this. Like he completely trusts this man who obviously has not his, that's weird. But in the second letter, he gives the eunuch permission to take his wives into the countryside if they get bored and want a break. But you'll notice at the beginning of the third letter that the first wife has ordered the eunuch to take them into the countryside. And if you know anything about Muslim dating systems and you read it really carefully, you'll notice that the third letter is actually dated before the second letter. So that the chief wife has ordered the eunuch to do this, and he's done this, and then retroactively Uzbek gives permission. So like things are actually not what they seem in this harem. That this is not the sign of great power and such. So there are all of these subtle signs of political struggle. And I don't think that Montesquieu needs to be this opaque about it. It's like, so why is he writing in this way? Because it'd be more interesting if he just came right out and made the drama like big and central. But I think what he's doing is cueing the reader in to the fact that I'm being subtle here. So if you notice these discrepancies in letters like 2 and 3, you start looking for these discrepancies. And you start looking for all of these other ways in which these readers are really problematic, or they miss really obvious things. You're in the show, right? His description of Paris theater is hysterical once you can get past that initial screen. Rika describes the theater actually in a really honest way, whereas he thinks the show that everyone's come to watch is what happens up in the boxes, which is actually what everyone comes to see when you go to the theater. Like everyone wants to watch the nobility on display and who's fighting with who and who's flirting with who. And yes, there's the show on the stage, but that's not really why people go to the theater. Like you go to preen for your neighbors and to be and Rika, this really naive Persian, just writes this letter to his friends like on, and he describes going to the theater as if that's actually what the show is, not realizing that there is actually this, he's like, yeah, and there's music in the background that accompanies the show, which is the actual opera. But he sort of recognizes that, so there are all of these, Montesquieu then sort of uses this kind of, this naive narrator to begin to really brutally expose the hypocrisy at the heart of Regency French culture, right? And yeah, I think that's really what this novel is about. And so that's where we'll turn on Monday. We'll start to look at ways in which, how is French society under attack? And do you think it's funny? Do you think it's not funny? The letters are overwhelming. Pick a letter or 5 or 10, but like try to take notes on a couple that you think are really revealing. And if you miss stuff, it's okay, because there's so much going on. But try to find a letter that seems like it's got this second layer to it. See if you can catch one of them and say, I think this is what's really going on. That's where we'll start on Monday. All right? Have a great weekend. Get some rays.